Welcome to our explainer. The cities you see in modern Turkey, they didn't just spring up out of nowhere. We're going to dig into the decades of government policy that literally shaped every street, building, and neighborhood.
So, have you ever looked around a Turkish city and wondered, how did it get to be like this? Well, it's not random. Not at all. It's actually the result of a 60-year story of deliberate, conscious planning. All right, so let's get into it. This whole story really breaks down into three big, distinct periods of policymaking, starting way back in 1960. Okay, first up, the first wave. Our story really kicks off in the 1960s. You have to picture it. Turkey was a nation on the move. People were just pouring from the countryside into the cities. This led to this massive, explosive, and frankly often uncontrolled growth that would really define the country for decades to come. Right at the start of this, in 1961, a new constitution comes along, and it introduces this really important idea of the social law state. Basically, this made it the government's official job to manage all this crazy rapid change and, provide for people's basic needs. Now, the central challenge of this whole era can be summed up in one word: gecekondu. These were essentially unauthorized houses. People would build them, sometimes literally overnight, on land they didn't own, all because they were flooding into the cities looking for a better life. So how did the government respond? Well, their big idea was a series of 5-year development plans. One after another, each one was an attempt to just get a handle on this chaotic situation. And what's super interesting is that right from the beginning, the government had to face reality. They basically said, look, we can't just go in and demolish all these homes without offering people an alternative. And that single decision, it had massive, long-lasting effects. All right, let's move on to the turning point, the 1980s. This was a seismic shift. It all started with a military coup, and what followed wasn't just a tweak in policy, it was a complete overhaul of Turkey's entire economic philosophy. To really get why this was such a big deal, you have to look at the numbers. Think about it. Back in 1960, Turkey was a mostly rural country. Less than a third of the entire population lived in cities. But that huge wave of migration we mentioned, it just kept going, relentlessly, for 20 straight years. And it was fundamentally changing the very fabric of the nation. And that brings us right here, to the tipping point. By 1985, the scales had totally flipped. For the very first time in its history, Turkey was officially a nation of cities. More than half the population was now urban. And look, this wasn't just some dry statistic. It was a massive, fundamental change in the country's identity, and that meant its policy priorities had to change too. So the policies shifted, and they shifted dramatically. The government's new goal was to plug Turkey into the global economy. This meant giving more power and more resources to local governments, the municipalities. And it meant creating new institutions. The big one, the one you've probably heard of, was TOKI, the Housing Development Administration. Its job was to lead these huge state-sponsored housing projects. Okay, let's jump forward to the modern era, the year 2000 and beyond. This brings us to another major pivot, an era that's really been defined by a new, very powerful, and sometimes pretty controversial idea. What kicked it off was a tragedy, the absolutely devastating 1999 Marmara earthquake. After that, urban policy had a new, urgent #1 priority: making cities safer from disasters. And the main tool they used to do this was something called kentsel dönüşüm, which translates to urban transformation. The whole idea was to redevelop and replace risky areas, especially those older gecekondu neighborhoods with modern buildings that were built to withstand earthquakes. But it wasn't just about internal factors. This new phase was also being shaped by global trends, and especially by Turkey's ambition at the time to join the European Union. Those international standards played a really big role in how city planning was approached. So, that brings us to today's cities, built on yesterday's decisions. How do all these different layers of history, the rapid growth, the global shift, the focus on safety, how do they all come together in the cities we walk through today? When you step back, you can really see the story of the Turkish city evolving in 3 clear steps. First, you have the 60s to the 80s, which was all about just managing the rush, reacting to the massive growth of those informal gecekondu settlements. Then, from the 80s to the 2000s, it was about opening up to the world, integrating cities into the global economy, with institutions like Toki leading the charge. And finally, from the 2000s to today, it's been about actively remaking the city, focusing on this idea of urban transformation, driven by those safety concerns and global ambitions. And that leaves us with one final thought. After decades of plans that have shaped the very ground we stand on, the story of Turkey's cities is obviously far from over. It's still being written every day. So the big question is, what should the next plan, the next chapter, really prioritize for the future?